Okay, so we're gonna see how this goes. This feels a little bit like bad stand-up comedy. I did not expect to be using a microphone and a clicker, so we'll see. You'll also notice that I'm definitely the academic. I really should have gone first. April and Mila did amazing presentations with beautiful, seamless transitions. And I'm more going to have a conversation with you about my research and a thought that I'm evolving and hopefully get your feedback. In many ways, when you have an opportunity to do a talk in front of people outside of the academic community, you take advantage of it because you want to get feedback. Are you experiencing these things in the real world? And thus, can that impact my research and the research that's happening at Quinlan? So today I'll be exploring challenging the status quo, the impact of insubordination in the workplace. And as Maychek mentioned, my work actually is in interpersonal mistreatment, destructive leadership, and insubordination. So I'll begin with a definition, like any professor. Insubordination is defined as subordinates' disobedient behaviors that intentionally exhibit a defiant refusal of their supervisor's authority. And so I published this paper at the Journal of Business Ethics, but when writing it, my team and I really thought about, can insubordination be sort of values neutral? Is it possible that insubordination could be positive? Could it be negative? We certainly associate it with negative things, right? Many of us have seen insubordination in the news associated with the lack of use of PPE or perhaps even a lack of adherence to a vaccine mandate. These aren't something that we necessarily associate with positive connotations. But my argument is that it possibly could be quite useful, especially when we consider challenging the status quo on a larger level. So one of those levels obviously being the leader and a follower, right? So this dynamic between a supervisor and their subordinate. Perhaps you have an abusive supervisor, an abusive leader, and thus you refuse to do something out of spite, out of pettiness. I don't want to do that, right? That kind of malicious compliance mandate. However, we can also think about challenging the status quo at the organizational level. So one of the examples that I give my students and I think is interesting is what happened after President Trump entered his presidency. We saw that environmental scientists began hoarding data, essentially, with the creation of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. This is essentially rogue employees within the federal government that decided to guerrilla archive data on climate change. They felt a threat happening within their organization, and thus they were insubordinate and were trying to do something positive for society at large. Lastly, we see challenging the status quo at a very social level, a societal level. Over the last several months and even years, we've seen dramatic social movements like Black Lives Matter. So again, can it be good? Can it be bad? So insubordination, obviously we affiliate with being very frustrating for a manager, right? This is something that we definitely don't want to happen and ultimately can lead to an employee being fired. But we can also look at the counterpart or the second side of that coin, so something being positive. This is Eric Young. He is the CEO of Zoom. April mentioned Zoom already. I think Zoom was going to come up no matter what we talked about, right? I could have stood up here and talked about, I don't know, anything, and Zoom would have come up. And so, but what I want to mention here is that he actually came up with the idea of Zoom and cloud computing video conferencing while he was at WebEx. Some of you may be familiar with this story, right? He pitched the idea, certainly a form of creative deviance. They passed. He continued to work on the idea and then ultimately founded Zoom, which has now become a multi-billion-dollar company. Similarly, when we think about maybe government activists, people that we see in society at large. So this is Lilly Ledbetter. She was she was an executive at Goodyear Tire Corporation in the 1990s. She realized late in her career that she was being underpaid and was victim to the gender pay gap. And so ultimately she brought a lawsuit against her company, which led to eventually, much time later, the passage of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. All right, so I want to kind of look at insubordination into two buckets. The first is destructive insubordination. So these are things that can honestly be brought on by lack of motivation, perhaps frustration in the workplace. and even burnout, right? We see burnout really affecting employees today. But studies show that we can actually address destructive insubordination if we look at the leader-follower partnership. So recent studies suggest that the better the relationship quality between supervisors and their subordinates, the lower the cases of insubordination, specifically those that are destroying or impacting an organization negatively. So what can leaders do? This is ultimately why I wanted to choose this topic. I want to give you tools that hopefully help you in your day-to-day work. We can build on existing relationships with followers to create psychological safety, which allows them to express their concerns, their questions, and their new ideas. The other side of the coin that I also wanted to kind of get your feedback on is the idea of constructive insubordination. So some forms or ideas to consider are denying an ethical request. They happen every day. It's something that we don't like to think about, but unfortunately, supervisors ask their subordinates or team members or those around you to do something unethical. We teach about it in business cases. But how do you respond? And is that insubordination? I would argue that it is. It's challenging the status quo. It's not going along with what is being asked of you, and thus it's a form of constructive insubordination. The second being creative deviance. Many of us have side hustles. We have these great ideas that might be related to our industry, but we fear that our employers may not be interested. It can be quite constructive, right? It can be productive for us to work on these ideas. You have companies like Google that give time allocated to generating such innovative ideas. But it still can be considered something quote unquote negative. But I think that when we look at it from a constructive standpoint, we can actually benefit our organizations and society at large. That brings me to the power of workplace culture. I think Mila did a wonderful job of explaining what culture is and how we can actually improve cultures, right? It's this weird phenomenon that academics write about, but in reality, I think it's really how you feel and whether or not you feel at home in your workplace. And I think one way that we can actually improve constructive insubordination, allow people the space to actually say, no, I'm not going to do that. Or, yes, I'm going to spend time on something outside of my day-to-day work, is allowing ourselves to build cultures based on trust and empathy. And this brings me to my last question. How do we harness and leverage defiant thinking? I think that we associate defiance with this very negative thing, right? It's a going against the grain. But I think ultimately it can be incredibly positive at multiple levels. And so I argue that a huge part of this is values-based leadership. So I am a leadership scholar. And most of the time, leadership research looks at independent variables and dependent variables, right? We're looking at leadership forms and how they lead to positive or negative behavior. And when I think about constructive insubordination as a positive behavior that we want to foster and embrace in organizations, I think of values-based leaders that can be the leverage and the catalyst for that. So values-based leadership describes behaviors that are rooted in ethical and moral foundations. The reality is I joined Quinlan because of how much it is embedded in the mission-driven thinking of Jesuit tradition. And so I think that we are looking for leaders like this to lead us within Quinlan and above. And I think many of you probably are looking for that in your own organizations. So there's some prominent forms of values-based leadership. We see those being spiritual, servant, meaning putting someone above yourself, authentic, ethical, and transformational leadership. So how do we embrace values-based leadership, either individually or within our cultures of our organizations? We lead from a place of purpose, higher calling, and emphasis on benefiting others. We also need to develop our ability to know ourselves and our own values and beliefs. And then lastly, what I really want to emphasize here, just because I don't really know where you are in your own careers, but something that I found incredibly useful is prioritizing personal reflection. I think that anyone, no matter where they are in their leadership journey, can prioritize reflection, and it can be incredibly beneficial. So what can you do? I think that it's nice to have a little wrap up, right? We have looked at some really big ideas today, right? The new normal, it's incredibly overwhelming. I think honestly, all of us thought we might be past the mask thing by now, and we're not. It really can feel like I'm just one person. You know, I can't solve everything that's happening in my organization from a resignation standpoint, but you're also all of these other things, right? You are someone who holds lots of roles and wears lots of hats in your life. And so what I want to leave you with is, how do we embrace becoming better leaders for tomorrow? Again, I'm a leadership scholar. So becoming a leader of tomorrow, I think requires a few things. The first is embracing the chaos of our time. This is something that I tell my students literally every week. This is where we live. This is the timeline that we're in. And I think it requires us accepting it and trying to figure out how can we be our best selves within it. The second is mission-driven thinking. Maciek related to us, explained that to us as it relates to Quinlan earlier. But mission-driven thinking can go beyond just our institutions. It can be a part of our own mission. What is our personal mission, right? What is our family mission? What is our organization mission? I think we need to advance our moral development. Whatever you can do to advance your own moral development and the moral development of the people around you. And I think that ultimately leads to championing social justice and equity issues within our workplaces. And lastly, I just want to leave you with this. I think challenging the status quo can be quite difficult. It's painful at times. We get nervous when we try to go against the grain. But I personally believe that that's the only way that we can change, and change is such a necessary process. And so with that, thank you for your time.